series dedicated to the seminars of Jacques Lacan. Today's video is on lecture 14 of seminar 1, entitled The Fluctuations of the Libido. Following questions will be addressed. 1. How is desire realized in the subject? 2. What is the function of speech in analysis? 3. What was Freud's mistake in the famous case study of Dora? So let us begin with the first question. How is desire realized in the subject? We discussed in the last video how the ego is that function in the subject that misrecognizes its desire. This misrecognition emerges from the original specular moment. We project our unformulated, chaotic desires onto the other who mediates this desire on its way back to us, now in a distorted form. This relation of alienation is how the subject comes to identify itself as the ego. The imaginary relation with the other offers a framework for our primitive libido in which we fluctuate between love and hate. First, we invest libido in the other who offers us our ideal ego, experienced in the register of love. Then, there's a regression of this libidinal position, leading to aggression and hate. It's here we find the basis for the Oedipal rivalry. The mother becomes the loved object, while the father represents a barrier to it, leading to a retreat of libidinal investment, manifesting as a hatred toward the father. We can also see here how there's a double meaning of the phrase, the subject's desire is the other's desire. First, the subject's desire is the desire for the other and produces feelings of being in love. Second, the subject's desire is the desire that is in the other, leading to hatred. One's desire in the other leads to hate because it represents the site of one's alienation. It also leads to hate because it represents a source of competition and rivalry as ego and alter ego desire the same object, which in the Oedipal rivalry is represented by the mother. But this imaginary relation...
弗洛伊德讲过俄狄浦斯嘛？你在说什么？俄狄浦斯弗洛伊德最大的贡献不就是他发现了俄狄浦斯吗？是他把那个弑父娶母这个事情套到无意识上面去的。
has far wider implications for our lives and what's going on in society today. Collectively, we place our imaginary investments in objects that can lead to intergroup rivalries that spill over into violence. And this can be a very effective means of generating political power, such as when leaders take two groups identified in their perceived poverty and turn them against each other by suggesting that one group is taking away the other's loved object. As the child's desire passes through the specular other, it continuously receives approval and disapproval, acceptance and rejection. These responses by the other take hold as the rules of the game, so to speak. And this is what Lacan calls the apprenticeship into the symbolic order, whereby the child learns the rules of their social situation, generally communicated verbally by the word no. Through this apprenticeship, the child learns to consent to the law, which serves as the foundation for the symbolic order. With this comes the internalization of language, and it's language that offers the opportunity to realize or recognize one's desire. Such recognition is done by naming desire through speech, which mediates desire and brings it into a system of language. Anyone not familiar with Lacan, and even those who have read him for a little while, can often have difficulty wrapping their minds around how language can be so powerful as to be the means of realizing one's desire. How is it that naming desire...
可是也说的不对啊，不是语言。我们可以说能指 signifier 或者说这个 symbolic system， 但是不要说语言，因为 language 在拉康这里是一个非常次要的东西。后面研讨班2它会有一章专门讨论这个 language 跟 speech 的问题，语言跟言说的问题。然后在那一期它还跟几个杠精、辩精，就是说。比如说如何区分言说跟语言，但是那一期我看这期还蛮简单的，就是怎么说呢？如果你读过海德格尔，那一期非常简单，但是不读海德格尔的人就很难。反正就是我的意思，这个后面他会再来讲这个问题啊，就是说关于这个语言跟这个言说的问题。 对一般杠精来说是比较难理解的东西，但事实上并不难。
Realizing one's desire. How is it that naming desire can be so transformative? Lacan offers a clear demonstration of it in the example of the name elephant. He says that without even so much as ever having seen an elephant, much less having one amidst us at the moment, we can make decisions about them that have immense ramifications for them. Naming the elephant thus is greater than the actual animal. It is the first reason that Lacan will say that the symbol is greater than the object. It's also a reason why naming desire can be so powerful. And in case you ever wonder why the cover of the French edition of Seminar 1 and the English commentary on Seminars 1 and 2 have the elephant in front of the cover, now you know. Perhaps you can think of examples in your own life when the name has had such power. Feel free to leave any examples in the comments below. The question, what do you want, is exceptionally important and powerful. It could almost serve as a ritualistic prayer in which we perpetually ask ourselves, what is the desire that is operating in me? It's a question without any definitive answer, but a question that can spiral into ever-deepening considerations of the question. There are times in my life when I experience free-floating anxiety, in which almost everything and everyone can evoke irritation. I then become fixated on every momentary settling of this irritation. But in asking myself, what is my desire? It requires that I look at my anger differently. And on occasion, a name comes to mind, that perhaps I'm seeking respect or appreciation that I'm not currently receiving. This has the power of transforming the very meaning of my anger. Of course, if I stop asking the question about desire at this point, I'll have aborted the process of reintegrating my desire back into my subjectivity or of reconstructing a history for it. The point is that even though we should continuously try to name desire, we also shouldn't settle on any single name. Now we'll address the second question. What is the function of speech in analysis?
他刚才讲的那一段完全在胡说八道。
Psychoanalysis is called the talking cure. This title is especially appropriate when considering Lacan's approach. Through the fundamental rule of free association, psychoanalysis frees speech from the petrifying understanding of the ego, which thinks it knows what it says. It also frees speech from the demands of courtesy and coherence that restrict it. Free association is not aimed at getting the analysand out of the imaginary, but rather to inaugurate oscillations in the mere relation to the other. In these fluctuations, the analysand can begin sensing how their ego functions, identifying those objects that give it consistency, nourishment, and body. It also allows them to see the diverse parts of this image, recognizing the stages of desire as they express themselves in the ego's history. This idea that the ego has a history is important because, as you'll recall, the point of analysis is reconstructing the subject's history. By delivering a history to the ego, the subject may integrate the ego in and through language. So the first phase of analysis induces a passage from a position whereby the ego is unknown to the subject to a recognition of one's imaginary investments through the act of naming. Without this recognition, desire becomes forbidden and thus becomes repressed. More precisely, it's speech that is repressed and embedded in the subject's symptoms. The act of naming shifts speech from these symptoms to being embodied in the history of the subject. It authentically integrates the subject's desire into the symbolic plane. Lacan also notes, again, that the recognition of desire is not the same as its satisfaction. Desire is always the desire for desire, the desire of desire, not the desire for satisfaction. This aim of analysis to reintegrate the ego overturns a widespread way of understanding analysis. Such an understanding is typically encapsulated in Freud's famous statement, which the Standard Edition translates as, "Where id was, there ego shall be." In other words, the goal of analysis, according to the standard interpretation, is the strengthening of the ego to override powerful unconscious influences. The French translation, which Lacan and his audience would be most familiar with, reads, Le moi doit déloger le ça, which translates, the ego, le moi, shall or must dislodge the id, le ça. Lacan has a different reading of this, which he'll address in the following lecture. In short, he understands this as the need for the ego to be reintegrated into the subject. In light of this role of speech and analysis, we can now answer our final question.
不行，他讲的这一段整个都错误很多。
What was Freud's mistake in the famous case study of Dora? This case study by Freud can be found in the 7th volume of the standard edition under the title Fragments of an Analysis of a Case of Hysteria. It concerns a young woman with the pseudonym Dora who developed various physical symptoms without any underlying medical explanation, including coughing and mutism, what has been called hysteria. Dora was brought to Freud by her father upon accusing the husband of another couple, Herr K., of making unwanted sexual advances. Herr K. denied this, as well as her father disbelieved it. However, Dora soon tells Freud of her father's love affair with Herr K.'s wife, Frau K., and Dora believed that her father was offering her to Herr K. as almost like a kind of exchange. Ultimately, Dora terminated analysis with Freud following his interpretations of her dreams that suggested Dora's repressed desire was for Herr K. and her father. Freud identified this as a failed analysis because he ignored the role of transference and later expressed regret that he didn't emphasize Dora's feelings for Frau K. So what went wrong here? Lacan states that Freud involved his ego in approaching this case, talking to Dora at the level of experience of others, by which I think he means on the level of the imaginary. This led Freud to operate out of the imaginary understanding that girls are made to love boys, which led him to suspect that Dora is secretly in love with Herr K. A critical point here is that the subject must name their own desire. It can't be the analyst's role to name it for them. To get there would have required Dora's oscillating between love and desire. In that situation, she may have first seen Frau K in terms of her ideal image, reflecting narcissistic love. Freud actually just stopped there and didn't go any further with it. He didn't allow for the oscillations of Dora's ego that may have opened the possibility to see that Frau K was more than a mere object of love, that she was in fact the object of desire. And Dora wasn't allowed to name this desire. Lacan ends this lecture by identifying the second phase of analysis, which he
为什么要学这个？因为我是小布呀，这个学的比较高贵，学这个能显示出我的优越性。你可以去知乎喷我的。
He states requires understanding the function of the ego ideal, its relation to the superego, and how the analyst is to occupy this function for some time. And we'll end our time today on that note as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next today. To occupy.
我不读玛丽毛，因为我饱。因为我是个老鸨，我不像你们造派那么对，那么根正苗红。对，你去造一个，我给你鼓掌，我也就配给你鼓掌了，我不配做实践。
Of this desire, and Dora wasn't allowed to name this desire. Lacan ends this lecture by identifying the second phase of analysis, which he states requires understanding the function of the ego ideal, its relation to the superego, and how the analyst is to occupy this function for some time. And we'll end our time today on that note as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
他这一期基本上就是加了自己很多的理解，然后再胡说八道，基本上。
Through the fundamental rule of free association.
他竟然说什么通过什么命名欲望讨论你的症状，然后把这个东西重新整合进一种自我，他到底是不知道自己在说什么？没有什么 reintegrated 的 analysis 为什么会有用？analysis 为什么会有用？因为这个案主 案主觉得它有用，简单来说就是这样的。他恰恰是要让那个案主意识到这个就是这个 ego 的分裂，恰恰是要把过去那种对可以被命名的东西，并不是重新命名，而是发现过去的那个命名只不过是出于某种无意识，然后那个无意识被误认成一种自我。所以我是觉得，就是他这里竟然还在说什么要重新整合进什么自我的历史，然后什么主体就可以恢复正常。我觉得竟然还在想这种东西，分析就是要说服客户，当然不是啊！我天哪，你就听那个直播间泡着这水平，你天天到底在学什么？分析到底是什么 ？psychoanalysis 到底在分析什么？他没有在分析任何东西啊！与其说是分析，不如说它是一种创造。事实相反，它也不是认识你自己，它是重新创造自己。分析重点是从欲望到驱力，这个不是一直在讲吗？你要是听不懂，你就自己再去研究吧。从欲望到驱力，这个之前读期的课是不是听你在捣鼓这个事情吗？也不是刷机模式。我们今天说这个问题，就是精神分析这个 analysis 到底在分析什么，或者它为什么会有用？一个人如果不相信精神分析，你觉得你跟他说话有用吗？就没有用，对吧？你就随便大街上你拉个人给他精神分析，你看有没有用？就这里面弗洛伊德对这个事情他也讲过，弗洛伊德的说法是那个就是没有受过良好教育的人是不能被精神分析的，分析不出东西来。弗洛伊德这么说的，说这东西跟什么受教育程度有关系啊，其实跟受教育程度也都完全没有什么关系。阿康所说的精神分析是什么？就是你不会跟一个穷人借钱，还有另外一部分人也分析不了，除了这个弗洛伊德所说那种就是说没有受过良好教育的癔症患者也分析不了，就那种过度自我分析的，比如说直播间的各位，就也分析不了呀。我这样做是意味着什么？我那样做到底意味着什么？我这样做是因为什么？因为我移情了。我那样做就都搁这儿过度反思，也精神分析不了。这个精神分析过程中最大的障碍在谁身上？在分析师身上，就是分析师他。比如说他举这个例子，这个朵拉这个失败的例子，朵拉的案例这个失败的例子，就是因为弗洛伊德他自己的移情嘛。就是分析的过程其实是一个斗争的过程，是一个战斗的过程。在这个过程中，分析师要克服的就是自己的那些移情什么的。就简单来说，精神分析是什么？精神分析是一门实践了。通过这个实践，一次良好的精神分析可以让你发现主体的不一致，主体的分裂。但是如果你能意识到这个问题，就是说我还该怎么说呢？就是这个实践是应当长期进行的，因为精神分析并不是治疗，它事实上它也治不了什么病，它让你发现这个主体分裂的时候，看你要不要把这个症状接受下来嘛。只不过是这个实践让你经常进行的时候，你可以不用陷入那种无意识的欲望的循环。从不反思的人更容易行动吗？不见得。你这些话都没办法回答你。比如说就是说反思的人怎么样，不反思的人，这都是某种普遍性的话语嘛。这种普遍性的话语都代表着一种主人能指，对吧？就是当你说这个话的时候，它有可能是大学话语，比如说从不反思的人是否更容易行动什么的。这里面不就是是这个 S2 在说话吗？就有是否有某种普遍性的真理指导性的理论？没有这种东西，不一定。但是为什么主体喜欢讨论这种普遍性的话语？因为你的无意识。你能想在直播间装逼吗？就是说你获得了某种理论，什么什么有反思力的人怎么样，没反思力的人怎么样，获得了某种类型学的知识学，通过这些东西你就可以要么就是你想你想指点别人，或者是你想什么什么之类的。这就是精神分析我们在讨论的，明白我的意思吗？就是它会让你始终跟自己的那个就是言说的主体你能意识到这里的不一致之处，这样你就不会始终陷入到那种，就是他把你从那个比如说我们所谓的从齐泽克所谓的从欲望到驱力嘛，就是欲望就是说这个无意识的欲望的循环，对吧？像比如说你为什么想说这个话什么之类的。精神分析重点是要分析自己吗？不是，你自己也分析不了你自己啊，自己对自己永远是不透明的呀。我也分析不了，你都无意识，你都意识不到，你怎么能分析到你自己？我也分析不了我自己啊。我也得经常听别人说， 就是别人对你的判断，即便是再庸俗，也比你自己对自己的判断是更准确的。所以它作为一个实践，它就是一个 two body and more， 就是双体以及双体以上的 psychology。如果是把它以某种心理学分类，它其实就是一种实践了。通过这个实践，它就会时时刻刻消除你生活中的种种的症状。比如说我前一阵有个症状是蛮严重的，就是我一直身材焦虑，就老觉得自己比如说腰不够细啊，屁股不够大啊什么的。但是问题在于我又知道我这个只是一种就是症状，但我觉得无所谓。我觉得说反正就是总得犯点病吧，就犯这个病好了。但事实上，对啊，我也是得听别人说啊，你还身材焦虑哦，算了吧。我想到确实也有道理，算了。所以我就跟你讲，这些症状都莫名其妙的。你说今天我也会身材焦虑，你想看一些女明星也会容貌焦虑，你会觉得真的犯不着，莫名其妙，对不对？所以意思不管你自己多明白，你就是会就是做这种很愚蠢的事情。所以你知道，就像你觉得魏明子怎么样？魏明子也就是非常之愚蠢，就是每个人都有这种愚蠢的地方，你自己分析不了你自己，就得听别人说才行。不是不为这些症状自责，不是，哎呀，你们到底在说什么？对啊，弗洛伊德也很蠢啊，弗洛伊德经常有老白男的强迫症的幻想嘛。魏明子非常之愚蠢，确实是。然后魏明子的聪明之处就是他愿意展现自己的愚蠢，这就是他的聪明之处。就是所以说他哲学学的比较好嘛，他没有那种自恋的幻想，因为他觉得他这个愚蠢，就他恰恰是就是知道他这个愚蠢不是来自于主体嘛，不是他的责任，他只是这个对他只是这个世界历史的一部分而已，他就愿意展示自己的这种愚蠢，就这就是他的聪明之处。就是精神分析这个东西，就是简单来说，我就说它是一种实践。实践其实就是一个反思，但这个反思不是一种虚假的反思。什么是一种虚假反思？什么是一种就是比如说有效的这个精神分析的反思活动？这个就又讨论到最后的这个对，就是事件的真理性的问题了。精神分析总会到最后就是社会批判的问题嘛。但是我觉得识别出4种话语模式非常重要，就是比如说什么是有效的反思，什么是这个就是虚假的反思，其实就是看你最后的那个你进行分析过后的留下那个话语模式是什么嘛，就是你要能识别出来是比如它是那个议政话语啊，它还是主人话语，是大学话语什么，对吧？反正拉康的意思是，反正你也就是说只要你是这个议政式话语或者是分析师式的话语，那么这个话语它就是可以被认为是某种这个就分析师话语嘛，就是某种这个有解放性的话语了，就是它就不会停留在什么主人话语、什么大学话语之内。只有走到这个四种话语，我觉得还是稍微就是说提出了比较就有些比较激进吧，就比较进步的想法吧。然后它之前都还不太行。但问题是，精神分析就是分析师共同体，就是一个失败的实践模式啊。就拉康想搞的那个这种共同体的模式已经失败了，就是你想进入实践也不一定非得是精神分析式的实践了。分析师话语，那我问你，分析师话语跟大学话语有什么不一样？就是本来这个拉康他觉得自己不是，我能明白他又开始唯实践论，他就说要实践，只不过他不够唯实践论，因为他既然说精神分析是一种实践，精神分析是一种失败的实践，就是它不够那什么。不够有解放性吧，或者是精神分析师话语到最后始终是要导向变成议政话语的，因为它只是一个现在拉康他现在想解散的那个，他最后不是把那个什么分析师共同体解散了吗？都还是留下了一个，就像现在列明论他们那个组织，那个组织其实也现在就是收那个精神分析费，收版权什么之类的，就凭这种东西的。就是他本来以为可以有某种什么分析师共同体，但其实也没有。所以说精神分析它本身其实就是一个失败的实践了。就我们天天讲这个东西，主要是这个精神分析就天天讲什么主体不一致性啊，什么分类的主体啊，这个东西其实最后是要上升到资本主义意识形态批判嘛，上升到这个问题，就要接这个理论来，要接这个理论批判来，所以要不停的讲这个精神分析。而且讲精神分析，它可以把什么辩证法什么那些东西都把那个什么辩证法什么海德格尔什么就是精神分析，它是现在的一个这个怎么说呢？就哲学比较 或者是反哲学啊。精神分析本身是门反哲学，是门实践，就是说比较这个思想上的一个就高级东西吧。就是通过这个高级东西，你如果就这些东西能听明白，你再看其他的东西就是都很简单。所以说讲这个东西的意义是什么？意义就是你们听了之后，你们从此再看其他那些什么文化产品啊，什么那些社会精英啊，人上人天龙人啊，你就觉得这胡说八道呀。没有什么东西是他讲过的东西，你本来会被他那些什么流派、那些什么大词儿什么之类的糊弄住。现在你听起来你在胡说八道时满口喷粪。你说你这个东西，别人就是你想讨论这些问题，那些意识形态这东西就那个什么拉康什么，其实早就捣鼓完了，这些东西就这个人满口喷粪了。那个拉康，我刚才不是给你们讲那个什么门是什么？门是属于什么象征？这个就是他跟一个什么类似时代论杠精讨论这个什么自然科学之类的讨论的这些东西，就是在跟你说这些事情，说那些东西就是你讲的要什么什么时代论，想要什么什么控制论，什么自动机那些东西，那些东西都是简直都是被他批过的，就是那种很愚蠢的他来说。所以说学这些东西好处其实也就是你能不怯场，能不被那些人忽悠住，也就是这样了。然后至于说有什么实践，就比如说你能不能从这个精神分析导入实践，你如果是从精神分析内容学，当然不能导入实践，但是你在我们这个直播间聊精神分析，这个就不只是在精神分析，对吧？这个就不在于这个精神分析内容，在于这个精神分析的某种就是实践的形式嘛，就是这个形式在就是鼓励你、指导你进入实践，就这个形式的意义是远远大于这个讲什么内容的。简单来说，就不讲精神分析，或者是不讲比如说拉康这些东西，或者我们就不管这个，还有事实上我们也没有在讲精神分析啊，我们也在说我们在批判嘛，就是这个内容其实并不重要，你赞同这个内容还是你要批判这个内容并不重要，其实重要就是这个。只是这个形式而已了。只要大家在一起直播间，我们在这晚上没有在那什么，对吧？没有看女主播，没有在玩游戏。大过年的，别人都放假，我们还在学习，我们在讨论一些严肃的问题，进行一些比较严肃的思考。就这个形式其实就够用了。就是说，至于说它到底内容是什么，无所谓的。其实这也是精神分析的意思，就是说只要大家在一块儿，然后形成某种共同体的严肃的什么讨论问题什么的，就可以了。至于说你能不能听懂他讲这些玩意儿无所谓的，但确实有些东西很难，或者是你听懂了你怎么样了？你听懂了你会觉得说啊，你说的很有道理，然后我要去什么进行实践了吧？但当然也有很多那个讲知识学的哲学的主播是这么想的。对，那也没见他自个儿进行啥实践，就是你哲学的内容根本就不重要的。你像那狗子，他天天就搁那儿标那些什么哲学黑话，什么寒冰蛇冰无情人，也没见他进行啥实践。狗子只是个穷学生，别要求太高。我没有要求什么呀，我只是说我没有要求他实践，我只是说他作为一个什么哲普什么 UP 主，如果他没有转化成讲的东西是狗屎，我没有要求什么呀，我只是进行我的评价而已。我就是跟你们说，重要的是这个形式，不是那个内容。至于他爱实践不实践那是他的事，跟我也没什么关系。
Psychoanalysis frees speech from the petrifying understanding of the ego, which thinks it knows what it says. It also frees speech from the demands of courtesy and coherence that restrict it. Free association is not aimed at getting the analysan out of the imaginary, but rather to inaugurate oscillations in the mirror relation to the other. In these fluctuations, the analysan can begin sensing how their ego functions, identifying those objects that give it consistency, nourishment, and body. It also allows them to see the diverse parts of this image, recognizing the stages of desire as they express themselves in the ego's history. This idea that the ego has a history is important because, as you'll recall, the point of analysis is reconstructing the subject's history.
反正他内容我好久没看了，但是他其他几篇内容我看了看，真的不知道在说什么。第5章完了，第16章总算到 Heidegger。
Welcome to Thought and Motion.
但换句话说，狗子再狗屎也比你强呀。那再狗屎你还能帮他说话，谁来替你说话呢？
A series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video is on lecture 15 of seminar 1, entitled The Nucleus of Repression. The video will ask the following questions. 1. What is the relationship between trauma and the symbolic? 2. What constitutes a successful repression? And 3. How does the superego emerge? If you enjoyed this video, please like it and consider subscribing to my channel. In this lecture, Lacan revisits the case of the Wolfman. This case involves a depressed individual whose analysis focuses on a dream he had at a young age where he sees 6 or 7 wolves sitting on a big tree in front of his window. An interpretation is eventually put forth that leads to the uncovering of a primal trauma that occurred at an even younger age, somewhere, Lacan estimates, between 6 to 18 months, in which a child witnessed his parents having sex a tergo. Lacan uses the Wolfman to develop his understanding of trauma and its relationship to the symbolic. He identifies what he calls the prägung, a term used by ethologists to signal the process of imprinting, a time-sensitive period of learning. Lacan locates the prägung in the imaginary and notes the term's connotation for striking or having a stamping effect. This traumatic event is not traumatic all at once, however, but becomes so après coup, retroactively, upon one's entrance into the symbolic world. It's in this sense Lacan offers one of his more famous expressions that repression is the same as the return of the repressed. In other words, the repression enacted by the symbolic is what retroactively charges the prägung with its traumatic character that now, in a sense, can roam free by borrowing particular signifiers to express itself in a manner at odds with the rest of the symbolic system, such as through symptoms, dreams, and slips of the tongue.
这就是没有先于回归之前的压抑了，这个可以理解吧？这个其实还蛮好理解的，但是这个还蛮重要的，因为这些东西是对那种什么荣格那种什么潜意识什么那些东西最好的反击。
Such a situation can be considered an example of unsuccessful repression, whereby the symbolic has failed to fully integrate these life events. So what then constitutes successful repression? Successful or normal repression is where there is no return of the repressed, that the primal scenes of one's imaginary world have been properly integrated and forgotten, to the point that even the forgetting has been forgotten. Lacan links this notion of successful symbolic integration and the forgetting it entails with Heidegger's depiction of our entry into the world through what Heidegger calls lethe, which translates to forgetfulness or concealment. It's a forgetting that goes hand in hand with the notion of aletheia, which literally connotes unforgetting or unconcealment, but is often translated as truth or revelation. According to Heidegger, the being of beings discloses its truth through both aletheia and lethe, that is, through a dynamic tension of revealing and concealing. This is the dialectical tension in which truth plays out, and it's something along these lines we see Lacan draws upon in his own discussion of the dialectic of forgetting. Now, shortly after Lacan introduces Heidegger's terms, a member of the audience notes that there is a major discrepancy between Lacan and Heidegger on this point. First off, Heidegger would never use the term success, as this is a purely psychoanalytic term. Secondly, what Lacan considers successful repression, the forgetting of forgetting, would be for Heidegger an inauthentic mode of being. Authenticity entails hearing the call of being that breaks us out of our forgetfulness, projecting ourselves, through anticipatory resoluteness, into our ownmost possibilities. At risk of misrepresenting the term, one way we may think of being is as the field of pure possibility that gives rise to particular beings in the world, but is then subsequently forgotten by those beings. Lacan responds to his audience by making a very interesting observation here. He states that Heidegger made authentic existence into a kind of philosophical law, a law probably to be understood in the sense Lacan would use the term as a kind of paternalistic prohibition. Now, why would Lacan and Heidegger be at odds here? For Lacan, there's no authentic being in the world, and it's certainly not the most originary starting point for subjectivity. Rather, we are always already interpolated by what Heidegger would name the they. We receive our being from the they, and as such, our subjectivities are born out of a fundamental alienation. So we may say that our most authentic self is, for Lacan, our originary and originating inauthenticity. It's on this point we see what appears to be Lacan's departure from a phenomenological ontology.
就是他这里其实对海德格尔的评价其实还是有些误解的。但我也不是海德格尔专家，我只是说就我理解的，并不是这样。
Despite the clear influence by Heidegger, which is evidenced by the number of times he's already come up explicitly or implicitly in this seminar. Let's move on to our third question. What is the origin of the superego? Lacan notes that the superego first makes an appearance as the censor in Freud's early work. A censor operates through deception. What deception? Lacan notes that the unconscious emerges because the speaking subject can lie, which means the subject is not equal to what it says. The superego is responsible for this split in the symbolic world, making this lie possible by leading one part to be accessible and another part of the symbolic to be inaccessible and forbidden. This schism of the symbolic system amounts to the emergence of the unconscious. Now, the superego has a similar role to play as the law does in the wider symbolic order. But the difference is that it exerts its pressure upon the subject more forcefully and demands more than the law does. Lacan offers the example of his own patient whose symptoms are an expression of an unrecognized function of the Quranic law. Lacan uses this case to demonstrate that a part of the symbolic law can still function even if it no longer operates in one's linguistic community. And in this case, it's the law that one shall get their hand cut off if they are caught stealing. That element of the law acts like a discordant statement that gets pushed to the foreground by earlier traumatic events. Here, the law is reduced down to the point that it assumes an unintegratable character. And we can now understand a little more fully how repression can be unsuccessful. There seems to be a kind of conspiring between our primal traumas and this element of the symbolic. But why would the traumatic event lead to this manifestation of the superego? The connection is not exactly clear to me from the lecture alone, unless we consider the notion of repetition compulsion and Lacan's earlier statements concerning the origins of masochism. It would seem at some level a piece of the symbolic, perhaps out of some phonemic relation to the event, gets extrapolated from the larger symbolic system and ceaselessly repeats itself in a manner similar to how Freud's grandson repeats Fort da. This appears to be the superego, which functions as a blind, repetitive agency independent of the symbolic order. Yet its vicious attack upon the subject is in exchange for a little piece of enjoyment that comes with delivering some symbolic mastery over the primal trauma. We can note at this point the convergences here between the emergence of the symptom and the emergence of the superego. However, we can recall that the ego was equated with the symptom par excellence earlier in this seminar. In some sense, it seems that the ego and superego share some kind of intimate relationship here, though on different planes, the ego being on the imaginary and the superego being in the symbolic. It's perhaps for this reason that Lacan will note that it's not enough to name desire, in other words, to address the subject at the level of the imaginary. This is only the first phase of analysis. And the second phase, the analyst must occupy the position of the superego. Why is this, and how would that work? I imagine it will be to reposition the subject's relationship to the symbolic and especially the superego itself. But we'll have to keep these as open questions for the time being. Thank you for watching. As always, you're free to leave comments, questions, and I look forward to seeing you.
他讲这些其实后期拉康都讲明白了呀，没有什么。当然，他觉得他刚才其实重复了很多，他重复的是对的，但是他觉得他没理解，其实就是那个意思啊，没有什么不理解的。就是比如说什么超我啊，什么禁令啊，什么什么什么什么之类的， 它本质上就是受虐狂啊。我之前讲那个3-8那个游戏时候，不是讲了弗洛伊德那个一个小孩挨揍那个案例嘛，就揭示主体的受虐本质啊。受虐本质就是强迫重复呀，这也不叫本质了，就是说无意识自动机的工作机制。为什么只有这个创伤才能强迫重复呀？因为不是trauma它也重复不起来啊，不是trauma它不就是可以，不是trauma的话它不就是可以融入到 symbolic 里面去了吗？主体不就是那个凸出来的东西嘛，那个凸出来的东西 symbolic 不能理解的东西啊，就是它就是通过不停的这个强迫重复，就这些 trauma 才能维持住自己意识的清醒啊，就是一个最低限度的痛觉吧。就好像我们在说这些梦境，弗洛伊德说梦境是欲望的满足嘛，那其实说的是反过来的，就是说也是对的了。当然了，一切病人来看都是对的。梦境并不是欲望的满足，或者说你的欲望并不是获得满足了。梦境其实就是 trauma， 就是那些创伤能指的不停的重复，就是保持一个最低限度的痛觉。真的这个最低限度的痛觉，这个创伤敞开的东西，才是维持你这个主体性的那个最低限度的那个分裂的东西啊。如果没有这个 trauma， 你的这个主体性不就融入到这个 symbolic 去了吗？但是这个 trauma 它有2部分，首先它不能太近。它为什么不能太近？因为你太近的话，它就会变成了，就你就会更焦虑。因为这个 trauma 其实就是 trauma 本身就是那个快感嘛，就是快感就是对快感的拒绝嘛。所以说这里比较难理解的是这部分，就是说就主体为什么牢牢的绷着那个 trauma 不放？因为你想想看，你不绷着那个 trauma 不放的话，你就想想看你为什么得犯病嘛？你想想看你为什么不停的犯病嘛？你为什么害怕自己没病？你去看心理医生，你内心第一想法是什么？就是我一定得憋，把我的病情说得很严重，我就不能被他3言2语说我没病，其实就是阻抗嘛。你这里可以理解吧？就是他前面我就跟你说，精神分析最后，其实所有东西都只是一个机制的一个过程。然后它里面就是把这一个阶段叫阻抗力，就是他们前面没想明白这些问题，其实想明白它就是一个过程，就很简单。就阻抗什么，就是你就抱着那个 trauma 不放嘛，你就怕人家说啊你没有病，你或者说你这个病就是一个很平凡的病，你就是什么这那之类的。你说不，我这个是天选之病，我这绝对不是一个平凡的病啊，是我什么我怎么样，然后你就拼命的想，就说出一些非常创伤的东西，你也说不出来，你确实也没什么特别创伤的东西，然后就只能就是重复。就刀逼刀，就变成祥林嫂。就是你为什么非得绷着这个 trauma 不放？人家没有这个 trauma 就真成一个螺丝钉了，你就受不了这个事情嘛？你就完全是可以编入这个 symbolic 这个 universe 嘛，对吧？这个普遍性封闭的宇宙。问题就是你就是这个封闭宇宙，他受不了了，把你甩出来了，把你挤出来了，对不对？那你肯定他被你挤，就是你就是这个 trauma 呀，就是你通过 trauma 这个最低的痛觉来维持住你这个主体性了嘛。就也不是说你为是主体性的，在这里我们更辩证，这个就是这个主体性是什么？这个主体性这里是要回到谢林了，就是它是来自于一种对恶的意志，来自于一种向上的意志，就是自由，其实来自于这个敞开嘛，因为他受不了自己的不自由，所以他把自己向创伤打开了，所以就用了主体这种东西。所以说在这里面 super ego 有什么 super ego 就是通过这种压抑，通过这种你的 trauma 就是通过这个压抑产生的嘛，但是这个快感也是通过这个压抑产生的，它是通过拒绝快感来产生这个快感的。所以这样我觉得我可能还有很多东西没讲到，但我觉得讲到这里应该挺明白了，对吧？就是你们大概也能明白说这里讲到海德格尔，其实拉康后来解释这个 speech 就是言说跟语言的关系，他用的就是海德格尔的，讲得非常的精彩。而且我觉得那里他对海德格尔理解其实是正确的，就海德格尔会说人就是那个追问嘛，对吧？就人不是那个什么有个更本真的存在，不是，人就是那个追问，就是他始终想问，比如说什么是更本真的，什么是什么这那的。然后他就讲这个 speech 言说什么，就是这个追问嘛，就是语言是语言在拉康那里什么是 SR， 就是能指宝库。那么那个从这里面出的那个东西，出去的那个东西，那个言说，那个 speech 那个东西就是这个追问。speech 就是人不得不说，人必须要说，但人为什么必须要说呢？然后这里拉康就是讲了那个例子，就是那个后来齐克讲的很黄那个，说背后白色盘子黑色盘子，然后齐克变成了什么？齐克变成了什么？那一个什么女人被什么黑人白人干，被谁干那个问题，对吧？就是逻辑时间嘛，3个时刻，就什么揭示的时刻、理解时刻、真相时刻。真相时刻是什么？就是说你得行动，对不对？ 就是你得行动起来。为什么你得行动起来？因为你是通过其他人的行动来判断你的行动的，所以说就是你要快。对，我先讲就是他研讨班后面讲的那个就是那个 speech 跟这个也不是博弈论，你还没明白这个问题。他就是说你就是那种静态的模型全都是不成立的。博弈论是什么？博弈论是什么意思？博弈论是就是说没有伪装的情况下，对不对？你是知道别人知道还是不知道的？问题就在于事实的情况下不是这种封闭系统，你不知道别人知不知道呀。逻辑推理的但是就是因为在这个拉康讲这个问题，就是说你为什么必须得言说，必须得行动，必须得起来，必须得动这个东西，因为你必须得比别人快一步才行。这个比别人快一步就是这个 haste 嘛，这个 haste 是什么？这个 haste 就是那个就是说言说的那个东西，就是说你要快点的说，在别人眼里你是谁？这个 haste 其实就是追问了，就追嘛，它要有一个这个欲望 erotic 产生的过程，其实就是欲望产生的过程了。就是这个其实就是时间性了，就是通过这个急这个 haste 就在逻辑时间里面如何变成了这种主体时间性的展开，就是你要比别人快一步才行。它那个逻辑时间就是讲这个东西啊，就是说因为你不知道就是说别人到底是他已经看到这个事情还是没有看到这个事情，但总之你得快一步。反正就是说这就是 speech， 就是你得言说，这个言说其实就是一种行动，但是这个行动就是存在了。其实那这个存在也是依靠一个镜像的关系，一个不在场的就是他者的那些什么凝视什么什么之类的产生的。总之就是这里就是他讲的那个海德格尔的这个部分了，就是说什么压抑啊，什么存在之类的。这里我觉得他对海德格尔的理解比较当然了，齐德克也是这样评价的，说海德格尔走了一半怂了，走一半怂就是他仍然认为有某种什么有某种什么本真性的，就是他不能认同那种本真性，但是像拉康认为是一种症状，就是这个什么快感以及快感的拒绝。然后这个海德格尔认为那种 authentic 那种本真性，它还是具有某种就是天命，具有某种什么是某种天命，是某个什么类似一种方向吧。但是齐德克的意思就是说他觉得海德格尔怂了一半就在这里面，就是他那种 authentic 那个本真那个东西没有那么本真。但是早期拉康是这个意思，后来晚期拉康他又回去了就是晚期拉康其实比较对的，就是他认为这个癔症 hysteria 就是女性了，就是这种姿态其实是一个解放性的姿态了，就是说是一个向未来开放的敞开的姿态。就这个还是比较重要的，就是说早期就是黑格尔不够海德格尔，就这里他不够海德格尔，就是他那个本真还不够本真。然后拉康早期又不够拉康，就是那个症状本身又不够症状，就是到最后其实还是一样的，还是要回去的。所以我的意思就是他前期讲这些原理，其实我们后面听就在讲这些原理，你不要就被他绕懵了。这个是拉康早期他每天想明白这些问题，就这个过程其实就是他这些理论逐渐发展的过程嘛。他这个时候他也没有想明白就是什么强迫重复那些东西，他后面才想明白这个问题的。其实强迫重复这个就是他发现了这个无意识是个自动机嘛，这个自动机它就是不停的把那个就主体这些烂糟那些东西就一遍拉出来。对，就是他们一开始就当然一开始他也认为说这是一个什么这是一个症状，这是一个什么，这是一个这个东西，这是一个那个东西。但是他没有他没有想明白的是，就这个症状它其实还是有某种这个对解放性的，但这个东西反而是弗洛伊德的发现最关键的东西，就人的无意识其实是个自动机，但这个自动机又完全不是那个自动机，或者说那个自动机又完全不是自动机你们知不知道我在说什么就是说自动机是拉康那个时代就是有门叫什么控制论的学问，就是在讨论人跟机器到底有什么区别嘛，就人所有的演算机器都可以做，对吧？人其实不就是每天也在解决这些什么加减乘除，就是某种算法之类的东西嘛。然后弗洛伊德那个时代就开始，弗洛伊德比较天才的地方就是他最大解放性就是人之死嘛，他发现人的无意识其实就是个自动机，人无意识不是什么那个什么理性那些东西，人的无意识其实就是也是那个能指 那个什么创伤，不停的什么想往那儿想往那儿去，跟你的理性没有关系，自己咔咔咔在那儿运转。然后意思就是人就是个机器。然后后来拉康说，就自动机的问题在于自动机本身就不是自动机。他的意思是你那个自动机不也是人造的吗？那个自动机当你人在把它造出来的时候，你设置比如说它做加减乘除，但是你评价的并不是那个数值，那个 data， 你处理的是那个 value 嘛，因为 value 到底是真值还是 false 还是 true， 你还是要有什么价值判断之类的嘛。所以是弗洛伊德认为说这个人的意识就是个自动机，人就是机器人，人死了。拉康意思不是，是自动机不是自动机，自动机就不是机器。就自动机，当你讨论这个自动机的问题的时候，你还是在这个讨论这个 value 的问题。对，就是差不多这个意思。
Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video is on lectures 16 and 17 in Seminar 1. If you enjoy this video, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. What are the 5 difficulties Lacan identifies in Michael Balint's object relations theory? 2. How does Jean-Paul Sartre's analysis of the gaze in Being and Nothingness establish a radical intersubjectivity? And 3. How do linguistic phenomena structure the imaginary? Usually these videos have, for the most part, covered one lecture at a time, but lecture 16 was abbreviated, and both 16 and 17 are concerned with contrasting Lacan's approach with another contemporary psychoanalyst, Michael Balint. Balint can be situated in the object relations approach. He distinguishes 2 modalities of love, pregenital and genital. The pregenital is noted for its needs being saturated by the object that satisfies it, represented by the mother's love. The pregenital is also noted for being a closed system that lacks any recognition of the other and their needs. This changes with genital love, whereby the subject begins to acknowledge the other as a subject, taking into account their existence and concerning themselves with the many requirements associated with the other's enjoyment. Genital love is thus marked by a kind of psychosexual maturation that makes possible satisfying object relations. Lacan initially offers some praise for Balint in incorporating elements of intersubjectivity within the fundamental analytic experience. However, Lacan spends most of these 2 lectures identifying differences he has with him, and in so doing uses this as an opportunity to further elaborate his own theory. Lacan identifies at least 5 difficulties with Balint's theory. First, it ignores the premature birth and fetalized traits that are present from the beginning. This is marked by the distinctive and prolonged dependence of the human baby upon its caregivers, and gives rise to a permanent biological instability in our species. This is something we have addressed in previous videos regarding the differences between humans and animals. Second, Balint's theory of love appears to run into a contradiction. Lacan first asks, if the pregenital is marked by a kind of autistically closed system, where do the capacities for recognition that emerge in genital love come from? In other words, how do intersubjective capacities emerge from a closed system of primary love? Lacan does not find a satisfying answer here, leading him to conclude that this theory runs into a blind alley or a theoretical impasse. Third, a reason for this contradiction is that Balint's theory of love fails to consider the polymorphous perversity of the child, whose perversions provide the privileged existential possibility for tearing open and forming a gap in us, allowing the symbolic to make its entry, and so giving rise to the possibility of recognizing the other as a subject. This is because perversion requires a 3rd term for it to function. To illustrate this, Lacan draws upon Jean-Paul Sartre's analysis of the gaze in part 3 of Being and Nothingness, a work that Lacan calls essential reading for.
然后有人说，然后人不是有剪了我一个那个切片嘛，说我有时候跟萨特一样，我这个2个眼睛会失焦，就是叫什么，就是对不上。我那一阵就是我最近好很多，我有一阵不是今天跟你们说我眼睛疼吗？后来为什么眼睛疼好了，我也忘记了。 反正就是我最近两个月吧，好像就是晚上直播眼睛没有那么疼了，但是我之前差不多有那么三五个月，就是到晚上就眼睛很疼。那时候我天天跟你们说晚上眼睛疼，然后眼睛疼，然后就两个眼睛就对不上。但最近好像好很多，去锻炼跟锻炼有关系吗？好像可能也有关系。反正那阵儿就不怎么，其实，锻炼我觉得其实就是你看书看电脑时间少，不是，就是那一阵经常会眼睛疼，然后就，对我觉得可能就是看你锻炼可能就是看电脑时间少，可能就会好很多。就看没有，最近好像好很多。
For the psychoanalyst, given his high praise and my own inclination to emphasize the philosophical dimension of Lacan's work, let's spend some time now discussing this part in greater detail than is provided in Lacan's lecture. I believe it will be helpful in clarifying what Lacan ultimately does with this analysis. Prior to part 3 of Being in Nothingness, Sartre has been describing what subjectivity is like for itself, which is the being for itself, consciousness, and as it is contrasted with the being in itself, which might be equated with the objective body. But there is another dimension to my existence that is pervasive and integral to lived experience. It's an experience of being a me. When I experience myself as an I take the attitude of looking out at the world and giving it the meaning I determined for it. However, when I experience myself as a me, this radically changes my experience. To explain this, Sartre evokes the example of shame, which is a kind of relationship to myself that I only get access to when I'm in the presence of someone else. I don't feel shame when I do something awkward or strange, except for the fact that I'm aware of others having noticed me do something awkward and strange. So the other mediates the relationship between myself and me. This is my being for others. Shame is a form of recognition that results from recognizing myself as how someone sees me, when I become judged and looked upon as an object by the other. Because I can only gain access to certain parts of myself through the other is necessary for me to realize myself. Sartre writes, therefore, if we wish to grasp in its totality the relation of man's being to being in itself, we cannot be satisfied with the descriptions outlined in the earlier chapters of this work. The other is something very different from other objects. When I perceive objects, they appear at a distance, remote and indifferent. People don't appear like that, however. They don't appear from a distance, but rather they appear intimately. I feel myself inside of them, in their consciousness, watching me. As Sartre says, there is a spatiality which is not my spatiality. This is not to say that the person cannot appear as an object to me. To look at the other as an object is what Sartre calls the conversion and the degradation of that original relation. I can take an attitude of distance, like the social sciences, and attempt an objective description of this person, their function within an environment, their behaviors, but this misses out on a fundamental aspect of existence. Once I consider the idea that this other is an other like me, who sees objects as I do, then it becomes conceivable that I can become one of those objects that the other sees, that I can be seen as an object. So the look of the other is not the act of an objective being, but another subject. The look is not literally about the eyes, which are merely sense organs that support the look. In fact, the look can be felt when one hears footsteps, or when one feels exposed in their own house when the shades are open and the light is on at night. In fact, we can expand upon Sartre's analysis in thinking about the function of the internet. The internet has provided a new world in which people felt they could operate in anonymity. One can no longer feel the look of the other. Shame was reduced and the person was free to express themselves in whatever way they wished. This, of course, has had a dark side to it with the emergence of cyberbullying and what are called internet trolls. However, it's also the case that now that we operate in the internet, especially more recently, that it's quite easy for others to gain access not only to our passwords and banking information, but also to our search history. there's the increasing feeling that whatever you type into the internet is available to the watchful eyes of the other. On page 406, Sartre makes one of his most famous statements. My original flaw is the existence of the other. Now, what could he mean by this? Similar to the internet example I just offered, Sartre uses the example of someone who could either be described as a peeping Tom or a jealous lover who's peering through a keyhole in the attempt to see without being seen. In this situation, I find myself in my total facticity and total freedom, a being unto itself, making choices and dealing with limits. However, at that moment in which the peeping Tom hears footsteps and notices someone noticing them, the entire situation changes. For the first time, I become aware of myself as a being. Before, I could focus all my attention on what I was perceiving. I may have been a jealous lover, but I didn't think about myself in those terms because I wasn't thinking about myself, only what I wanted to look at. But when the other arrives and I experience their look, my freedom is turned back upon me and I experience shame, which reveals to me who I am, a jealous lover. In this situation in which I am now ashamed by the look, the other becomes a master over me, and I experience myself being alienated, removed, and disconnected from my possibilities, no longer master of my situation. Sartre says, the other is the hidden death of my possibilities. At the end of this section, Sartre briefly mentions God, who becomes the concept of the other pushed to the limit. And so it's not even necessary for the look to come from an actual human. It may be a computer algorithm, or it may be an invisible, omnipresent, and all-powerful other who I imagine watches over me and all my thoughts and every move I make. So now let's bring this back to Lacan's lecture. Lacan addresses this analysis by Sartre in the context of balance analysis of pregenital and genital love, in which Lacan notes the difficulty of determining how the capacity for intersubjectivity could emerge from an original autistic state. Lacan then begins to suggest his own way of accounting for this by pointing toward the polymorphous perversion of the child that results from the permanent biological instability of one's premature birth. Perversion requires another to sustain it. One can't be sadistic or masochistic with an object. One needs another subject. And as such, this primary perversion constitutes the necessary opening for the third to enter into the closed dual relation between infant and mother from the very beginning. It's a radical or original intersubjectivity missing from balance theory. Lacan illustrates this using Sartre's description. Here we have what at first appears to be a closed system of two individuals caught up in an imaginary relation that is fundamentally narcissistic, I see you and you see me. But a third term is implicated in recognizing that I'm seen and in knowing that the other knows that they are seen by me. Now we become subjects for one another. How is this third term given? It's through the manipulation of the symbol. The fourth difficulty with balance theory is that it fails to recognize the role of the linguistic phenomenon in the formation of intersubjectivity. Yet language is what facilitates presence and absence. As Lacan puts it, and in reference to an earlier lecture, the symbolic function allows elephants to enter here. The other, I see, operates only on the imaginary level, but
他这里说的还是不对哦。他这里说的最错的是在哪里？我们一直在强调，不是语言，是能指，或者是这个 symbolic system， 对吧？或者是符号系统。这个拉康在后面我也忘记哪个研讨班了，就是讨论过这个问题，所以我始终记得他，因为他说的太有道理了，所以我就一直记得这个问题。就是说，我们这次讨论其实就是语言跟图像的关系嘛，跟画面的关系，对吧？其实这个其实就是数学上的那个，就是公理跟几何的关系，你们能理解吗？因为数学一开始也有一种倾向，就是所有的几何学都是多余的，所有的图像都只是一种想象性，最后其实都是公理。我数学很差，你们可以帮我补充，我只是来给你们讲解这个问题。所以这个其实就是数学的公理跟这个几何学，其实就是语言的，就是所谓的这个语言，就是他们总喜欢讲这个语言跟这个那个图像那个关系嘛，就是图像到底是不是多余的，就是是否是到最后其实只需要这个 只需要那个公理啊，就是一个纯的那个符号的那个逻辑关系 ，OK， 其实就是几大因果律了，就那些东西。就是否是如此？那答案是否定的，不行。就简单来说，那个图像它本身这就是能指的一部分，就是能指，而且能指还不只有图像哦，后来我们也知道也包括声音，对吧？整个符号系统包括声音、图像、符号这些东西，它不只是一个就是纯抽象那些东西。为什么不行？这也是这个，其实这反而是比较唯物的，因为你知道那个就如果你否认了这个图像这些东西，对不对？你就是只要纯抽象那个东西，那个东西是纯概念呀。但是如同后期拉康听搁那哥德尔不完美定理，你就知道了，就是纯概念反而是最靠不住的，对不对？因为纯概念是自我矛盾的呀，纯概念完备性跟这个叫什么完备性跟自洽性是不能同时都有的呀，就是你是不可能通过一个纯概念的符号系统使这个主观跟客观统一的，这里有点来到谢林了，让主客二元最后会汇聚到一个点上，对不对？这个汇聚到这个点上，并不是完全通过这个就是纯抽象那个概念的，你汇聚到那个点上需要的是，就是说或者我们这么说好了，图像的东西在哪里？图像的东西其实就是他刚才讲的在场和不在场。在图像上，这个在场和不在场是最直观的，对吧？不在场的东西是什么？就是我刚才讲的门，对不对？其实就是动。这个就是图像的，就是作为能指的关键的这个辩证之处，就是说，比如说这东西好了，对吧？它为什么会成为一个这个东西？因为它里面有个洞呀，因为它有个中空的东西，所以它才能成东西啊。它之所以是它是的东西，不是因为它有什么，是它没有什么。但是这个洞，你在这个符纸系统里面是表现不出来的，就是你在纯的那个就逻辑运算那条形数逻辑系统里面缺的就是这个东西。你如何从逻辑系统中来表现出这个纵深呢？这个不在场这个洞呢？不是无限性，就是主体其实也是那个，就是符号系统，它没有办法把这个空间中的那个不在场那个缺的那个东西，但是实际上是使它成为这个东西的那个东西表达出来，就是它表达不到不在场的那个否定性的这个东西，它就是那个主体就是这个否定性嘛，就这个 negation 嘛，这个东西在这个那个什么数理逻辑什么的里面，它表达不出来这个东西。就还是这个东西，就是齐泽克讲那个不加糖跟不加奶嘛，不加糖跟不加奶，你在数理逻辑里面都是同一个东西。所以我在这里给你们讲，就是他这里一直说什么我们遭遇的，我们主体是通过语言的运作，你们现在也能明白我说的意思吧？就不只是语言，它其实是能指哦，能指是包括这个图像，没办法完全被还原成什么逻辑什么抽象那个概念的东西的，然后包括声音这个剩余，对不对？所以你们现在能明白我说为什么这个才是唯物主义的。如果你把这些东西拿掉，那你就又真的回到纯那个回到那个纯什么庸俗什么唯心科学观去了。就只要你就是三体，就真回到三体去了，就是通过什么那个什么数学公式，你就可以发现什么宇宙的真理。你这个数学公式只是在某一个尺度下获得的对这个世界的一些现象的一个概念性的一个认识，但是事实上是你这个认识要去符合那个，就是你的概念是在你的这个实践中在不停的发展跟变化的。
But the subject I encounter in being seen gains its existence through the operation of language. This begins with naming, which inaugurates the symbolic within the imaginary from the very beginnings of life. From there, the symbolic will structure the imaginary in more and more complicated ways, shaping the inflection of one's imaginary commitments. The word inflection is a grammatical term. It's a process whereby words are modified to express different grammatical categories, such as alterations involving pronouns, verb tenses, and degrees of comparison. As such, the original captation of one's imaginary commitment can be symbolically transposed onto something else through what Lacan will elsewhere call the acts of metonymy and metaphor, which are the linguistic equivalents of displacement and condensation in Freud. The imaginary is accessible only through the symbolic as it's realized in adult speech, and in particular through the childish language that comes through. And by this, I think Lacan means the errors and mistakes that emerge through speech. This allows access to the lived history of the subject, a history that's shaped by the seesaw of desire, moving between imaginary identifications and symbolic introjections. This brings us to the fifth and final difficulty with balance theory, which concerns his starting point. Balance begins with the experience of the child and extrapolates from that the experience of the adult, which leads him into all sorts of difficulties. Polymorphous perversity, childhood sexuality, the Oedipal complex, and all those other concepts that sound strange to the uninitiated ear are wrongly assumed to be in reference to the child's experience. Lacan, in contrast, begins with the experience of the adult, and it's from that point of view that the child's experience is understood. Psychoanalysis operates by a logic of retroaction, the après coup, whereby the later determines the earlier. This is true in its theory as much as it is in practice, in which the analysan's early trauma acquires a traumatic quality only after the introduction of the symbolic, which itself becomes retroactively present from the very beginning. This is perhaps one of the most difficult ideas to get our minds wrapped around, since it violates our standard notions of time that undergird the linear causal reasoning found in the empirical sciences. And with that, we'll finish today. Thank you for watching. As always, comments and questions are welcome. And I look forward to seeing you all next time.
好吧，我们今天就学到这里哦。折磨呀。